I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it, and that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. This podcast is brought to you by Jarhead Diagnostics. Jarhead Diagnostics manufactures in-house diagnostic equipment and storage solutions, as well as distributes for companies like Pico, ATS, and TopDon. One of my favorite tools that I've bought from Brandon and Jarhead Diag is the case for the U-scope. If you don't have a U-scope, you probably should, but if you have one, you got to get one of these 3D printed cases, has a magnet on it, has a full-size BNC lead that you can connect to, and it gets rid of the weak point of that scope, which is the mini BNC connection, which is pretty fragile. This case makes this thing nice and secure and makes it an even better tool than it was. So check out jarheaddiag.com. The link is in the show notes. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. We have got Auto Rescue Tools and Isaac Rodell as a sponsor for this podcast. Hey guys, if you're looking for programming laptops, you want the laptop set up ready to go for programming control modules on vehicles, you need key cutting equipment, you need diagnostic tools, Isaac is your guy. Has all that stuff available for purchase, and the support that he offers along with the purchase has been outstanding. I bought some stuff from him in the past. I got my Dolphin key cutting tool from him several years back. And again, the support has been phenomenal. Helped me out along the way with anything additional I needed to make it work for me. Also, for the month of June 2023, they've got Autel updates for sale. So make sure to check that out as well. Again, that's autorescuetools.com. The link will be in the show notes. Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? This is the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping. I will be your host. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today on the show, I've got a couple experts that are going to be joining me, Matt Fanslow and Matt Skundrich. They've both been on the show before, so you should be familiar with them. Today we're going to be talking about scopes, digital storage, oscilloscopes, lab scopes. What are some of the benefits? What are some of the possible downsides? What's practical? what's the right scope for you and some of the features that you can utilize with lab scopes, where they're going to be most advantageous to your life as a technician, and where maybe they're not so practical. These two guys have a lot of knowledge on this subject, so I'm excited to get into this talk. Let's jump right in.
Oh, we're good to go. What's going on, guys?
Just trying to stay cool. It's very warm up here.
What is the temperature for you guys?
It warmed up today. We were above zero for a while.
Oh my gosh.
Degrees Fahrenheit. Yep.
Did you bust out your shorts?
No, but I one whole less layer. I mean, God.
Yeah, I didn't even grab my jacket this morning. I'm like, all right, cool. Sweatshirt will do the trick today. So
yep. Yeah, especially this afternoon.
Yeah.
It's 61 outside, and I think we had a high of 88 today.
Well, I'm going to Vegas next week, so hopefully a little bit warmer temperatures there.
Well, it depends. They might have snow.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah, we might have hit 88 inside the car I flushed the heater core on. That might have hit 88 in there.
Yeah, it was Florida's got nice weather. I mean, it gets to like 32 or 3 nights, and that's it. Like,
yeah, what happened to all the snow that moved across the south and it just stopped before it got anywhere close to Florida, huh?
Yeah, like it sees the Florida state line, and it's like, don't go there. Crazy people live there.
Disney paid them off.
Can you imagine if it snowed in Florida? Like, we see enough of the Florida man during the hurricanes. Can you imagine if there was snow and ice on the roads? Oh my gosh, it would be like
a lot like Texas,
next
probably.
level of memes.
Yeah, it'd be a lot like Texas.
Oh, it'd be worse.
Just not prepared. Yeah.
No, we all have generators and lots of gas because we have hurricanes from like, I don't know, April to October.
Yeah, that's a whole another level of something to worry about. I mean, at least in the Midwest, like, we don't necessarily have to worry. Tornadoes, I guess, would be the closest thing, but I mean, you have a whole season of hurricanes.
We have tornadoes, we have hurricanes, we have flash floods, we have thunderstorms you can set your watch to in the summertime. So yeah, we have fun weather. I always tell people, if you want to come to and experience Florida, you come in August. It hits like 103 with the heat index, and then it rains and you feel great, and then the sun comes out and it's 195% humidity. And you don't even have to go pay for a sauna. You just stand outside naked. And you're like, the sauna is here.
Yeah, I mean, what do you do for all your equipment? It's just got to be baking in your van driving around, huh?
I don't care. It doesn't seem to hurt it.
Okay.
I mean, my laptops sit in the cab of my Silverado, and they sit in there. You figure I come home Saturday night, park it outside. They sit out there Saturday, all day Sunday, and Monday I use them. I've never had an issue with the heat destroying a laptop.
None of the keys have letters on them anymore, but just all memory. Where's my home row?
I mean, I don't have soldering problems in any of my electronics. I mean, joints don't crack.
Just set the chips and resistors and then set it up on your dash and wait a few minutes.
So, funny story about that is when Toyota had their, like, hey, print this target, I bought a 3D printer for ADOS, and I was like, man, I'm going to 3D print a Toyota target, so I don't have to use all this black ink all the time. I had a really nice 3D printed target. It went on a tripod, and I stuck it on my dashboard one day driving to a job and forgot about it. And I come out, and it was like melted on my dashboard, and I'm like, great, there goes 12 hours of my life. Got to reprint that sucker. So, yeah.
Well, I know I was using my phone this summer. I mean, this is just up here. It doesn't get, we get a week where maybe it'll hit 100 or so. And I was trying to do stuff in a car. And of course, I'm just baking because it's outside in the sun and stuff. And my phone's like too hot to operate, or it need to like cool down or something. I'd never seen that warning before on my phone. But I guess, some of those electronics don't like the heat.
You learn not to put things in sunlight in Florida. Like, oh, there's a spot of shade. I'm gonna stick it there because my phone says it all the time. Like somebody will call and I'll throw it on like the passenger seat and I'll be working on something, have my Bluetooth on. Next thing I know, the call's gone and I'm like, what happened? Oh, phone's overheated. So then you got to start the car and hold it in front of the AC vent with no case. But my scope always works in the heat. It doesn't care. I mean, that sucker works. I think when they made the Pico, they were like, all right, let's find the hottest place in the world and see if the scope works. Let's just put it in our oven and see if it works, because I've never had an issue with my Pico. But my Cardac 3 Plus, the little rubber boots that are on the end, you
got your fingerprints on them, though?
No, they don't even stay on anymore. I've had Cardac send me like 3 sets. They get so warped from the heat, they just keep falling off. But my Pico little boot that it comes in, it's perfect. And the ASE, the U-scope. Yeah, that orange thing, man. You're never getting it off now. The heat like shrunk it to my U-scope. It's never coming off.
It's made out of heat shrink tubing. They didn't tell you.
I don't know what Carlos made that out of, but man, it's never coming off.
The screen's convex now.
I was like, oh, I need to take this off because I wanted to try to see if I could get a new battery for it. I couldn't get it off.
Tried to sell the idea to George. Like, look, you can see it better from over here. Those TVs.
Well, yeah, that's what we're here to talk about tonight is scopes. And I know we had some people in the Facebook group asking about lab scopes and stuff. And yeah, I think Skundrich, you can tell us why scopes are terrible, and we'll come up with some other ideas. And
so I don't know. It seemed a couple years ago, maybe I'm wrong, maybe 5 years ago, but in the last 5 years, it seems that Facebook is nothing but scopes, right? Like somebody goes, hey, I think I might have a bad purge valve. No lie, the second post is going to be, did you scope it? I'm like, you don't need to scope a friggin' purge valve, man. Did it click or not? Use your power probe. So I kind of became vindictive against scope users. And it's not that I don't use one, but I feel that in my job of being mobile, and Sean Miller will attest to this story, we had a Chrysler that had no start, and it was because the timing was off, right? And so I hooked up my YTech, and you could see sync, no sync, sync, no sync, sync, no sync. And if you've experienced these enough and you're used to looking at data because you've looked at enough known good data, I'm like, this thing's out of time. The timing belt's too worn out. It has 150,000 miles on this or something. I'm like, it's out of time. And Sean Miller was riding with me for the day, and he goes, whoa, let's get the scope out. I'm like, fine, you go get the scope. And I started my stopwatch. It was 25 minutes to pull my scope out and set it up. And then it's another 20 minutes to put it away. So it's 45 minutes we lost to verify something we saw on data. And that's where, to me, I have an issue with scopes. I'm not against scopes, and I think they have a purpose, but I think we overutilize them in some aspects.
yeah, and I mean, they can definitely send you down a rabbit hole. I think anybody who's used one's probably experienced that, where you overanalyze something, or you spend way too much time chasing something you think is wrong, some little thing, and turns out, well, no, that's not the issue. You know, there's something more obvious you could have found a different way. So there are definitely some pitfalls to using them.
Yeah. I will say that the times I pull out my scope first, and now let me clarify this, why I'm saying this. I'm a mobile tech that when I get called, they've fired the Identifix part cannon, right? So if I get a call for a misfire, they've already put coils on it, they've already put a plug in it. Most times it's had a fuel injector, but misfires. The first thing I pull out of my truck is my WPS and my Pico, and it goes right in cylinder, and we're looking at it. Running, cranking, because at that point, I'm almost guaranteed they have an engine problem. Very rarely do they not, and if they don't, I at least have a better idea of where this engine stands to move forward with other testing. And I don't even bother checking spark, fuel, nothing on if they're like, hey, we got this PO303, we cannot get rid of it. First thing I do is my WPS. I mean, That's literally my first thing. The other thing I pull it out for first is network problems. But I'm learning now with networks, if you don't have the correct breakout box to get out of the gateway, like on the new Fords, the DLC is the gateway. I think it started in 2015 or 16. Ford has a special breakout box. It's $400, but you unplug that gateway, you plug in this box, and it gives you like 30 banana leads you can plug into, because that gateway, that 16 pin, does not cover all the networks, and so that's why you got to have the Ford breakout. But those are the only 2 times that it is the first thing out of my truck every time, without fail.
Yeah, I just think with scopes in general, it's not even so much that the scopes. I mean, the scopes are getting better, but it's also the big shift has been in scan tool technology, and like the networks you're talking about, the speed. Scopes really started getting ignition scopes way back in the day, right? That's really all there was to look at.
Scope,
right? Ignition, and then in the earlier days of like OBD, all throughout OBD1 and then early days of OBD2, your number of PIDs was pretty minuscule in general. The update rates were horrific on a lot of car lines. Not all of them. Some of them were pretty rapid, but most of them, the update rates were not good. So you could look at something with more detail with a scope, even though it might be quote unquote kind of the same thing you would look on the scan tool. It's just the detail would be better because the refresh rate on the scope was so much faster than the scan tool. Well, now our scan tool speeds are picking up. The sheer number of PIDs we have, not just I don't know about if raw is the right word I want to use, but let's just say like you could look at TPS1, TPS2 voltage, but then there's also a PID that shows whether they agree or disagree, or a difference between the two, a correlation. So there's more of these calculated PIDs that take a lot of the interpretation out of our hands, or we don't have to use our brains or whatnot to determine that, to try to calculate that out ourselves. The scan tool does it. So it's just the real world. You fix a lot of cars sitting in the driver's seat, and 1 or 2 tests under the hood, maybe not even using a specific tool except the scan tool, maybe a dynamic test, listening for a click. And then, like you said, a power probe, meter. If you're going to scope it, you're going to grab maybe like the U-scope, right? Because it's basically a ultra fast graphing voltmeter, right? And that's what you would use. And I think that's just real life. That's how things are going. And we've also learned over the last decade or two the way to use data in our to our advantage. And the first thing that pops in my head is it used to be all the rage to scope mass airflows and do these snap throttles and see what was the peak voltage or frequency. That was just a regular test. That's what you did. I don't remember the last time I did that, when I kind of figured out, and I shouldn't say figured out, through classes, interaction with other techs, to use scan data, specifically fuel trims, to pick out a contaminated MAF or a failing MAF. You don't scope it anymore, and that's just stuff we've accumulated over time. That's not to say scopes don't have a purpose. They absolutely do, but it's kind of like, I was reading on some forum, it's like a press. You don't use it all the time, but when you need it, you got to use it.
Right. Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. Is when it comes to that one purpose, that one job, I mean, there's nothing else that's going to do it the same way. I mean, that's gonna nail down that problem for you like nothing else could. The U-scope is just so easy to use, and when I do mobile stuff, that's with me in my bag that I go to pretty much for every car. So 95% of the scope stuff that I do on that sort of diagnostic is done with that U-scope. And then of course, if I need to do 2 channels or, more detail, I'll grab out the Pico. But like Matt said, take some time to get that set up, all the leads out and everything. Have you guys seen, some people actually have like a mobile case for their Pico where it's like a box that's set up and easy to use. I don't know if something like that would be more advantageous, or I don't know, maybe if you're just in a shop and you have a cart, I suppose it kind of changes things a little bit.
Oh,
yeah, epically.
If I was in a shop, I would have a cart set up with a TV on it, and my Pico would be out. I would probably 3D print something so that I could have my BNC leads extended out of the top of the thing, and I'd have the prints labeled ABCD so I know what the channels are, and then I would have extension leads out from there, and it would be totally different. I would probably scope a lot more. But I think the conundrum of today is you have a lot of techs who don't have a 4-channel that can't do some of the stuff. They'd like to get into scoping, but they can't afford a Pico. Because let's face it, does Pico still make the 4425, or is it only the 4425A?
Yeah, they don't make the 4425,
right?
And you might be able to still locate them. Maybe some new stock somewhere. Otherwise, your best bet is used.
Right, but that 4425A cost a little bit more than what the 4425 did, and I get it, right? It's a great feature. There's times where I would love, because I'm mobile, and when I pull up my amp clamp, it's always freaking dead. So don't get me wrong, like I would love a 4425. I would probably scope more if I had one, because my batteries are always dead. I actually keep a 50 pack of 9 volts in my truck. That's how often I kill my batteries, but for a new tech to drop that kind of coin, it's unreal. So to me, if I have to rank scopes, the U-scope comes first, and I tell everybody to buy the master kit because it does damn near everything for one channel.
Well, I was gonna say, like, we could have a future episode on a list of our top 5-10 must-have tools, diagnostic tools. The U-scope would probably be on everybody's list, and fairly high up, because the usefulness of it, the affordability of it, it's not price, or cost prohibitive for most techs.
Do they make money selling that thing?
I don't know.
I mean, come on.
You hope so, but
it is George. Who knows?
For most of the stuff I don't know, maybe most is the wrong word, but for a lot of stuff you do, just that one channel, you might not even be looking specifically at a waveform, but you kind of want to see the whole picture. You don't want to just see a number, wherever that may be. Like, I love it for under dash stuff, checking, blower motor functions. I can have the current probe there if I want to scope the blower motor current, and then also the, however that blower motor is being controlled and the signals getting sent to the resistor block or blower motor control module. It's just bang, 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 bang. I don't need to really compare it to anything. It's just, and I could do it with a voltmeter, probably could do it with a power probe, but the scope is just that, it's the one more dimension, right? It adds the time domain, instead, as well as the voltage or amplitude domain. So that would be number one, or not number. It would definitely be in everybody's list of must-haves.
Top 5,
yeah.
Everybody must have list would have a U-scope in it. And my problem with me is the U-scope. I bought the advanced kit. It comes in a real nice pistol case. All my pistols have like the same case. It's called a pistol case. It's got this beautiful white, barely readable anymore AES Wave logo on it. And if I'm going to go to my truck and grab my multimeter to look at something, I just go ahead and grab that, because it's the same amount of work, right? Because it's one lead, positive and negative. Turn it on. The only beef I have with my U-scope is the battery sucks now because it's like 5 years old. So I have a external USB battery backup that I just keep, and I just plug it in when I forget to charge it. But it's easier to me to grab that than it is to grab my multimeter. The only time I use my multimeter is for an ohms test, and I know we could have the debate if ohms test is good or not, but I still use it. So. And especially if you're going to graph something simple, like I do a lot of body shops, right? So we have active wheel speed sensors. So I scope the crap out of them. The U-scope's number one for that. I mean, you can't beat it.
Yeah, doing simple. You just want to see a LIN bus. I was doing an open on a LIN bus, and I just want to check here in the circuit, and you can see the communication or it's not there. And yeah, so quick. So you can't beat that. What do you guys think about a scope as a learning tool? So I teach at the college and I work with the students, and my goal is not to convince them to go buy Pico as soon as they leave. I actually tell them not to do that. Obviously go buy the U-scope, but we use the Picos, and I think the visual, the graphic, drawing it out as a picture helps them understand the electrical concepts a little bit better. I mean, what are your thoughts on that for somebody who's just learning this stuff or trying to get better at it?
Yeah, I think for anybody, I think that's part of the appeal of the scope is you don't know how it really works. And the scope can give you a little bit of insight on that. Going back to the blower motor control module, is it just a varying voltage from like a potentiometer on the HVAC control head, or is it frequency modulated or duty cycle modulated signal that sends the signal for the request of blower speed? And using that, it's a quick way. Plug it in and I turn the knob, and what happens, and being able to see that change and see what it's really doing. It's just one more thing that maybe going to go brag to everybody about how you figured out how this is controlled, but in the back of your head, you've seen a control strategy. And the next thing with the antenna mast, how is that controlled? Oh, do they even have antenna masts anymore? That was probably a horrific example, but
the ones that go up and down.
Yeah. I don't know if I've seen a car with that in a while, but just,
I've never even seen one of those.
Yeah.
My 94 Park Avenue had one. That was the last one I saw.
But going back to your blower motor, I had a 2020 Mercedes that got into a really bad car accident, and none of the AC controls worked. Nothing worked. Now, I didn't realize nothing worked. I got told, hey, the blower doesn't work in the AC. Well, it's got a power ground and a LIN bus. So I scoped the LIN, called a buddy of mine, said, hey, man, have you ever scoped the LIN? What's it supposed to look like? Because I'm like, is it 0 to 12 volts? Like, what is this LIN? Like, it could be anything. And he's like, well, hold on, I got one in the parking lot. I mean, it wasn't the exact same car, but it was another Mercedes. And his matched exactly what mine matched. I mean, you could see real low voltage when it was at like 1. When you turned it on high, it was near 12 volts almost all the time. And so he's like, well, you got that, you got power, you got ground. No, it's going to need a blower motor. I can tell you, I put a $280 blower motor in. It didn't fix it. It ended up having crash data stored in there, and I had to reset the crash data with the factory tool in order for it to work. But that was a new learning curve on a new car. So welcome to the new generation of cars. Which is funny because I had crash data, but it didn't set the stupid battery safety crash in the back of the car. Oh no, only the AC set crash data. Stupid car.
Yeah, that's another challenge to scopes is the known goods, right? What is good and what is not, and that there's some groups and some websites and stuff that can help you, but it's not going to have probably that one thing that you're looking for.
Yeah, almost never.
Never.
Yeah, some of the circuits you're going to check, you can kind of figure out what it should. If you're looking at a solenoid and it's fed 12 volts, it's controlled by a module pulling one side low, close to ground. And then when it releases it, you're going to have, it's an inductor, so it's going to have a magnetic field that collapses and you're going to get a spike. You kind of have an idea what this will probably kind of look like. You might have some parameters you can come up with. 5-volt potentiometer sweeps like a APP or a throttle position sensor. You can, it's going to be a signal somewhere between 0 and 5 volts. The rough ones are like the crank versus cam correlation. You could tell that the crank sensor is probably good, the cam sensor is probably good, but now how they correlate to one another, sometimes that's not really in-service information. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times it's not. And that's where a database is very important, and it's kind of too bad we can't all just decide to support one thing, whatever that may be, even if we start our own website and then it's just everybody works to fill that. So that instance, when you need it, it's there, or broadcasting out to a large number of techs that could pull that for you off of running vehicle. It's now we have so many different places to go.
Well, that was the big thing when I started my mobile business 6 years ago. Was IATN was great for that 6 years ago. I mean, there were so many techs putting known goods on there, and if you needed one, you could get one pretty quick. But that's kind of died off. I mean, now it's about who do you know that's a scope nerd that just likes to scope everything under the sun. I mean, and that's the problem. And then you got people like me who see brand new cars, and I'm going, nobody's going to have a known good of this 2020. I mean, my wife has a 2020 Explorer ST. It's got a 3-liter twin turbo in it. It's the first year the Explorer has that car. I'm waiting for the day somebody asks for a known good on that because I'm like, all right, I guess I'll go waste my time and scope it. But I have no desire to even. I mean, I opened the hood one time and looked at it and was like, oh, thank God for a warranty, and I closed the hood. I mean, everything's buried, but if somebody needs something, I'll go get it. But that's the issue. I mean, if you don't have a known good, what good's a scope to me? And to me, the biggest problem is in cylinder known goods. I think it was Sean Miller had a Cadillac that had a really weird exhaust bump towards the end of the exhaust, and it had a running rough issue, and he posted in the group, hey, what do you guys think? And this was a newer car. Nobody had done in-cylinder one, but it was a 4-cylinder, so Sean had no issues doing it real quick. But all 4 cylinders were the same, but it was only pegging one. And so I said, Sean, you're going to have to get another car from that dealership. And it ended up being an absolutely normal phenomenon. But when you looked at it, you were like, oh, that's got to be wrong. That's got to be wrong. There's no way you should have this 1 PSI bump at the end of your exhaust stroke. I mean, it was just so absurd to us, but it was something to do with the VVT. That's what they did. And without that known good, Sean probably would have chased his tail, but he was smart enough to go, yeah, I think you're right. I think we need a known good here before I go down rabbit holes. And that's what he did.
Yeah. Especially if either a lot of classes or a lot of what you see yourself is just that textbook in cylinder running compression waveform, where the exhaust plateau is really, a little wavy, but flat. At 0 psi or atmospheric, however you want to interpret that, and the compression towers are symmetrical and all that jazz. And then the reality is some cars have normally leaning towers, and the exhaust plateau is far from just flat. It's got kicks here and there, and it's completely normal. So it's kind of one of them things where a lot of the stuff we do, regardless of what it is, scan data or scope waveforms, is you kind of have to note it and then kind of back burner it or set it off to the side. And it's like, I know that I have a concern about that, but I'm not going down this rabbit hole, because some people dive down those rabbit holes and it's an expensive lesson for somebody. Whoever's footing the bill on it, depending on your situation.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been there myself, and yeah, that's how you learn to put a pin in it and come back to it, because you're like, hang on. I remember last time I wasted an hour on this thing that I thought I saw that I thought was a problem. Those mechanical pressure waveforms, whether it be intake or exhaust or in cylinder. I mean, at least with electricity, I feel like there's some rules that it has to follow. It's mathematical almost, but man, when it comes to pressures, I realize I'm sure there's plenty of math to that too, but there's so many more variables and differences that you can have from engine to engine. There's no rules like electricity has to follow from different vehicles. So I've definitely struggled with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's in-cylinder compression. I remember the first time I saw electronically controlled fuel pump on a Ford. So this is, I don't know, late 90s maybe. And I've seen module controlled, speed controlled or whatever fuel pumps before, but it's usually just low speed, high speed. And it looks like a fuel pump current waveform, just one's higher and a little bit faster than the other. Well, this first one I did for a Ford, and being the moron I am, I saw this just mess of a waveform. I'm like, oh, geez, that fuel pump's junk. I've never seen one so bad in my life. Oh my God. Gets a new fuel pump, looks exactly the same because they're controlling that thing at some absurd kilohertz. In the kilohertz, they're pulse widthing that fuel pump, electric pump at, in the kilohertz range. And it is a mess. It's an absolute mess. You diagnose them. If you're going to scope current, you do it either key up or you take the module out of it and you just jump power feeding ground to the thing.
Going back to your school topic, I went to UTI, and when we learned scopes, I mean, we're talking 2005. So the 4-channel Modus that everybody loves, it still loves because it's a great scope. I mean, the old one where you could get the drawing program if you knew the shortcut codes on the thing, because that's what we all did in class. But that's what we learned on. And when we learned, we were not taught that the tool had presets in it. We had to memorize certain time bases and what the pattern should look like. And I'm still a big advocate of that today. I feel that presets are giving people a huge handicap, because if they see something they don't know how to do, they can't just correct it. They don't maybe understand what this time base, by expanding it or contracting it, how it affects the waveform, because they've always used the Pico preset or the Snap-on preset or the whatever preset. And that, I think, is a big problem with today's people, is they want it now. They don't want to learn it. They just want that picture now. And I'm like, no. Play with the time. And the Pico, even, you can change the resolution. If you change the resolution too far down or too far up, you'll get a goofy waveform if you don't understand what it's doing.
Yep.
You
almost. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the sample rate, not resolution. They call it sample rate.
Yeah, and you almost want to start students out with a analog type scope, even though maybe not necessarily analog, but like a benchtop, more general purpose type scope with the dials on it, because again, no presets, and you kind of learn that you can twist these knobs, change the voltage range, change the time base to get what you're kind of looking for, and that leads you into whatever the scope you're using, more conventional for auto repair, that you can just fiddle with the buttons and do the same thing. It's so for my 2-year automotive program, we had no scope classes. There's nothing to do with the scope. We had the college I went to had a not bragging, but it was really honestly a world-renowned band instrument repair program, and they had Hewlett Packard analog scopes, and the instructor wheeled one down for me to goof around with, and I poking and hoping, and just that's what I did, turn the knobs until I got something cool. Had no idea what it meant. I mean, no idea. And that was it. That wasn't tested on it, wasn't part of the program. My 3rd year, on the other hand, we had thick packets on, I think, 4 scopes. We had the Fluke 97, which was known as the kind of the grand piano. We had this rebadged Tektronix scope that was badged Mac. I don't remember the model number, but it was a Mac lab scope, but it was really a rebadged Tektronix. The Sun LS2000, which is maybe more familiar as a UEI 7400. Sound right?
I had the LS2000. It was a little handheld thing.
Yep, yeah.
And it had the button for vertical, and it only did up and down.
Yep.
And then it had the time base. It only did left.
Yep.
I was telling Sean about that when we were talking on the phone. I'm like, it was the best scope ever. You better have a 200-foot extension cord, though. That battery didn't last more than 45 seconds.
And then an OTC Vision, which I think was a rebadged Intero PDA 100 or PDA 50, something like that. So we had these packets, extensive packets with the little snap-on type of boards, and they would tell us where to position everything, and then you had to either draw what you had on your screen or print it out if you could. And that was eye-opening, just forcing you to do that. So then scope setup wasn't really such a big deal because you just turned the dials or whatever you needed to do until you got what you needed could see what you needed to see on the screen. And then, kind of back to what we were talking about before. Is it a 5-volt sensor? Okay, well, it should be within this range, I would expect. And
the manual setup teaches you things that you don't understand unless you've done it. Here's my example. If I'm doing take my wife's car and I want to do a cam crank sync, right? It's got 4 camshaft sensors, 1 crankshaft sensor. Well, I would probably do all 4 camshafts at one time. Well, you don't want them overlapping because they're all 5 volts. So you're going to probably set your voltage scale up to something stupid like 0 to 20 on each one, because then it's going to take up a fourth of your screen, and you can stack them all on top of each other, and you'll put the left bank on the bottom and the right bank on the top, or vice versa. And then you'll save that screen capture. Then you'll take one out, put the crank in, and because you have your previous capture, you can then overlay it or print them and look and go, okay, everything lines up like this. Let me go get a known good, because I'm not buying an 8-channel lab scope because that's just retarded. So, I mean, without knowing the manual setup, if you always did the auto and you ended up with 4 or 5 volts on your screen, it gets too crowded, and then you can't read it right, and it becomes other issues, and I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I like using the Picos with the students, is because you could download the demo software for free onto your laptop and not be connected to a scope and get up to 4 channels and go to town. I tell them just do, I have goals for them to achieve, but I'm like, don't worry about breaking something. If it's really messed up, just X out and restart and you'll be fine. And I think that, again, it's a really good learning tool just to get to know the usage. And I don't let them use the auto feature or presets. Just, I want you to know where you're at on your time base and your voltage scale on whatever you're looking at. I want you to have an idea of what realm we're in when you're looking at that line go across the screen.
Yeah. And it kind of would end up leading to an auto setup, but yeah, the advantage of that automotive drop-down menu of going in there and, not that it's very rarely vehicle specific, but fairly decent generic explanations of certain systems. So if they want to, you're coming up on the ignition unit in your engine performance section, the help menu, or not help menu, the automotive menu, the drop down menu, they can go in there and read about ignition systems, and I'm not saying it's like, Haywood level, but it's good. It's a good, kind of a cover, good overview. There's kind of diagrams, photos, and then you have some waveforms, and then a lot of them, and I think they keep getting a little bit better and better, is breaking down the waveform, what you're looking at. The popular one always being ignition, right?
Sure.
And breaking down the primary voltage or secondary voltage and stuff like that. What are you looking at? What does this part mean? What does this part mean or represent? Probably a better word.
So for me, learning a scope really came down to the Fords with the coil on plugs and the misfires. Because before somebody told me about mode 6, the only thing I knew was the scope. And, Snap-on, when you had the Modus, they had a special Ford coil on plug adapter. You could just put right over it. And my boss bought it because he had a Modus. And, I mean, I was in UTI, and we didn't really know about mode 6 too much, even at the UTI days. I think it kind of came out later once Ford realized even their techs couldn't fix them to look at mode 6. But that's how I really learned to scope, was them stupid coils, man. I must have done thousands of them. And it really became second nature at a point that it didn't matter. I could set it up so fast at the shop to scope them. And it's like anything else we do in the automotive industry. Like, I don't do nuts and bolts every day. But if Fanslow looks at a bolt and says, oh, it's a 10, it's a 10 millimeter bolt. I look at a bolt, I can roughly guess within 3 sizes now, because I don't take that many bolts out anymore.
Clearly, you don't hang out with me in the shop because that's what I do.
I'm like,
I'm pretty sure that's a 10. So I grab the 9, 10, and 11. And then I have to go back and get the 13 because no.
But when I was doing nuts and bolts every day, I could look at a bolt and be like, oh, that's a 10. Doop. And you got it. Oh, that's an 11. You knew.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was funny. Everybody jokes around too about calibrated torque wrenches in your wrist. You knew at a certain point if you used a torque wrench enough what 80 foot-pounds felt like in your small wrench. Scoping's the same way. I mean, if people would really sit down and do as much work with a scope and practice like we all did, and we joke around about now, they'd be proficient at it within a couple months. I mean, this isn't magic. I mean, it's very straightforward.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what scope you have. They all work the same once you learn the manual settings. And that's what the brilliance of this is. I mean, whether you have a Pico, an ATS, a U-scope, the Autel scope, which their new scope seems pretty decent. It's wireless. Or if you have the old Autel 4-channel, I mean, I don't think it matters. Heck, my first scope I bought was the Bosch MTS 5200.
Ooh.
It was $9,000 for the 4-channel color. I got every accessory. It was an amazing scope to have, but man, I paid dearly for it.
Man, that scope taught me all about aliasing and that the charging port shared the same ground as the scope channel. I had this Ford Ranger, so it would have been OBD1, so I had a breakout box on it, 60-pin breakout box, and a very, very intermittent stall. And every time I had my breakout box on there, and I had the 5100, which was the black and white, or the monochrome version of the 5200. The 5200 was color. Otherwise, I think they were exactly the same.
Yeah, that was the only difference, and that's why I bought the 5200. I wanted color because, you know.
Well, the 5100 battery was worse than the LS2000 battery, so we always had to have that plugged in. Well, what would happen is with it plugged in, it fixed the problem because it created I was basically using the scope and charging port as a jumper wire to ground. And I was fixing the intermittently ground going open. So hours of driving this stupid truck trying to get it to stall, never stalled. Customer would come and get it and they wouldn't make it out of the parking lot and it was dying. It's like, I hook up all my stuff. The customer would go for a ride. It's like, oh man, it must be you. Well, technically they're right. It was me. I was fixing it with the scope.
Yeah, the 5200 had a great battery. It lasted most of the day. At least 3 or 4 hours. But yeah, I don't know if they were ground connected or not because I never checked.
And then those scopes, along with the Snap-ons, were pretty bad about it. But I think Snap-on's digital signal processing was slightly better. That you could have a fairly fast, and fast being relative, but fairly fast pulse train, like a square wave, whatever it may be, a crank sensor, something like that. Especially in the photo electric, crank sensors or cam sensors, RPM sensors, whatever you want to call it. You would get the square wave on there, and maybe you'd have 4 peaks on there, 4 squares, cycles. You start slowing the scope down, right? And normally this would squeeze it down to something called wallpaper, where it's just a black, thick black or whatever color, I guess their channel is. But on the 5100, it was black. Just wallpaper. It was just this, you couldn't see anything. It was just this big, wide black mark across the screen. That's what you would expect. But the 5100 on the faster signals wouldn't do that. You'd start slowing it down. It would squash them together. And then there's a point where if you slowed it down one more setting, and what I mean by slowing down means putting more time on the screen, using a longer time base. So going from, 20 milliseconds per division to 50 milliseconds per division. It would go, all of a sudden it would explode open into a completely believable square wave again with, maybe I'm slowing it down, I get 10 cycles. I slow it down one more time and it opens up and I've got 6 of them. And they look like a legitimate square wave. But that can't happen. It's impossible, right?
Right.
It was a scope aliasing. It was redrawing a perfectly believable waveform. incorrectly, improperly.
Now,
Weird.
I think that was a problem on the 5100s, but I know on the 52 that I bought, each channel had its own processor, which is why I ended up buying it over the Snap-on, because it had basically 4 times the capability of a Snap-on, because each channel had its own dedicated processor. So maybe that was the difference between the 51 and the 52 besides color.
Yeah, I mean,
I never had that issue.
Yeah. It's crazy.
I actually lost it into a Dodge Cummins cooling fan. You know, the clutch fan? I was scoping something and the clutch fan kicked on and it scared the bejesus out of me, and I fell off the truck and I heard this really loud boom noise. Coolant was everywhere, and I realized that when it startled me, I had hit one of my leads with my hand and it pulled my whole scope in.
Oh no.
There was no more. It was a good excuse to buy a Pico, though. The other thing that was nice about that, I don't know if you had it, but their secondary wand was unbelievable.
Yeah.
I really wish I could get it to work on my Pico, but it had that fancy connector that screws in.
Yep.
And it's got like 12 pins on it. But it was nice, man. It had these like ball and socket joints, and you could coil that sucker all the way. And then it also had the wire loops that you could take a coil out, stick it down in, and I had 12 wire loops, so I could do 12 coils if I wanted.
Yeah, I mean, if you were kind of a scope guy, especially like back to the engine analyzer types, the sun scopes, quote unquote, if that was what you were coming from, and I don't know that I was necessarily coming from that, but you know, I had been trained on that type of stuff, and it was very appealing to have that type of capability. The 5100 was a no-brainer. I mean, it did that so much better than Snap-on. It wasn't even funny, and with adapters, and it had the different settings, you know, superimposed, raster, all that, and Modus eventually ended up with that too. But you know, the 5100, it was such a no-brainer. It's just the problem was, as a 4-channel lab scope, you had to be careful, but that's a learning experience too, right? I guess I went through that. I would say buying what I could afford or what the shop would buy me, and working my way up through scopes to find them, you know, as I gained in ability and, you know, knowledge, I suppose, skill, I had to get different scopes. And now I think, you know, we're talking about the U scope that's affordable and, you know, very, very capable. And a lot of these other scopes, you know, Pico's been mentioned a lot, that it's probably a pretty good investment. It's hopefully something the shop would take on, but if you're going to, your skill level is probably not going to exceed the scope, you know, unless you're buying one of those, you know, 2 and 4 channel, what are they called? Like entry level scopes, or
like the Hantex or something like that.
Well, Hantex, but I was also thinking like Pico has like a 22.
Oh, they have them
02 or 2205, 2105. No,
I call them knockoff automotive Picos. That's what I refer to them as.
They're attractive because of the price.
Right.
But the problem is, you know, you're getting what you pay for, and it's not so much like it's a pile of crap. It's just for what you need. It just doesn't have that capability. So, you know, if you drop the money on one of these, chances of you outgrowing it, you know, your skill level exceeding it, is pretty remote. Maybe the technology on the car, meaning, you know, what's the fastest speeds we're going to see on a car is probably network, right? You know, CAN, now FlexRay,
I was going to say FlexRay.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe those type of speeds, depending on the level you're going to try to scope them at, which I just don't think we're going to do, right? You're going to look for physical layers and you're moving on with life. Physical layer, just a fancy term for on a CAN signal. Your physical layer is the 1.5 to 2.5 volts, 2.5 to 3.5 volts. So CAN lows, 1.5 volt to 2.5 volts, square wave, if you will. And then CAN high is 2.5 to 3.5. That's what you would expect. That's the physical layer. So does it meet that? Do you need the, you know, blazing speed to do that? Probably not.
Have you guys seen, I haven't used it, but I saw somewhere out on the internet, there was a scope that would connect to your phone or a tablet, and so via Bluetooth. And so you could hook up the leads to stuff and then you could watch it on your phone or something. Looked like a kind of a cool idea to have something like that.
I'm mobile. My phone rings all freaking day. The last thing I want is try to be scoping something. And Fanslow call me going, "Hey man, how do I program this Toyota?"
Leave me alone.
Come on!
I was in the middle of scoping something, and I wouldn't believe him. So then we'd argue about him never scoping.
Yeah. And the worst part is until the recent iOS like 14 update, when somebody called and you were in a program, it took over your whole freaking screen. Yeah. So that was the worst. Now, at least on the they finally fixed it in the iPhone, and now it just pops up at the top of the screen.
And if I was calling them to help me with program something, it's going to be something jacked up. Like, can I do a used?
Yeah.
How do I program this Ford BCM into this Toyota? Can I do that? And then he'll be like, "Yeah, sure. You just do this." But everybody knew that.
I made a post about it, didn't you?
Yeah. Use the search function. Click.
I did that to somebody today, actually. I think we kind of talked about it a lot, but tech's got to realize that you buy a scope you can afford if you're going to buy one, and there's nothing wrong with what you buy as long as you're willing to use it. The worst thing I see is I go to a shop and they've got a scope sitting in a box and the leads are still wrapped in plastic. It's like, why did you spend the money? I mean, it's a waste. But if I got a tech who's like, "Hey man, I just bought this Modus and I really want to scope this. I don't know how." I don't care if I get 20 cars that day. My day has now just stopped and we are scoping this freaking car for this tech with that Modus. Or, "Hey, I got this U-scope because you showed me it last time. Can you give me 10 minutes of running through it?" Sure, no problem. In the U-scope, if you go to YouTube, Justin Morgan did fantastic walkthrough videos on that bad boy. I mean, hands down to them for making them videos, because I learned more about the U-scope from Justin than I even thought I knew. And they updated the firmware not that long ago, and it does even more. So,
and recently George got the manual together, which is really good. The user manual.
We have a user's manual now?
You do?
Oh, I'm gonna have to order one of them bad boys. I will say, don't plug the U-scope into a wall outlet, though. We have.
Dude, oh man, I used to work for the largest distributor of Pico in the United States, which eventually became Pico USA. And I kid you not, the worst thing that could ever happen is a tech ordering a scope, having it shipped to their house, and having it arrive on Friday. Guaranteed.
Put this
it was getting shipped back. That thing was getting blown up. You just can't help themselves. Sitting at home, got to try it. All right.
And no matter how many attenuators you put in it, it doesn't help.
I can go out in the garage and scope something on the car, but God, this outlet's right here. Bang, done.
Does it at least make a cool noise?
I've yet to pop a channel on one, so I don't know.
I really want to do it. I just don't want to buy the scope again.
Oh man!
But I mean, I will say I got an Autel scope when I was helping them with projects. They mailed me one and said, "Hey, just play with it. Let us know what you think." Because I've had an Elite for years, but I'm like, why would I use your scope? I got a Pico. And then I got it, and I'm like, oh, this thing's really kind of nice. Because, again, it came in a nice little case, kind of like my ASC Wave scope. But if I already had my Elite out, it was only one more case to grab, and it was smaller significantly than the Pico case because it didn't have near the leads in it. But it at least worked. And so for a while, I would tell techs, well, if you really want a 4-channel, just buy the Autel 4-channel. And I haven't got to try the new one yet on the, I think it's the Ultra, has the VCM1 that has the wireless 4-channel scope. I'm dying to play with one of those just to see it, but that would be even sweeter.
Yeah, I think having the touchscreen for the scope the laptops that we use at school for the Picos are touchscreens. You can do the pinch and zoom, and man, does that make it easy to use, just navigating and changing the shape of the waveform. Maybe that is, going around figuring out those user settings, but for just ease of use, you can change it to exactly the size you want and scroll through the waveform. I love doing it that way. So having it on a tablet, that's got to be pretty handy. I haven't used the Auto yet, but.
Well, if you want to try it, I will mail you mine and you can play with it. Because I'm telling you, once you use it, you'll be like, crap, I got to buy one of these. It's just so convenient. It's like the U-scope, right? Like, it's the next level of the U-scope to me. Like, the U-scope, okay, it did one channel. I saw this camshaft waveform. I know the camshaft works. But now is it in sync with the crankshaft? Because I still have this no start. Like, it to me is the next level. And then you have the Autel. If you get the Ultra, you can dual screen. So now you can look at live data and the scope at the same time. I mean, that's really taking it to the end all be all. One of the things I was hoping Bosch was going to do back in the day when they had the MasterTech VCI out, they had ESItronic. I really was hoping they were going to come out with a PC based lab scope so I could dual screen that, because now it's like the only reason I like my Pico is I can have my Pico on laptop A, my factory tool on laptop B, and I can look at both at the same time. The problem is I have two laptops out now, but I can't. The Pico takes too long to update when I need an update on 4 partitions, so now I have a dedicated Pico laptop.
Oh yeah, sure. Yep.
I will say I like the idea of a Surface though. I think Michael Burmester was telling me he bought some Surfaces for the Pico and he loved it because it was small, it's fast, it's light, and it has a touchscreen. None of my laptops are touchscreen. Everyone, I will not pay extra for the touchscreen. Just because for programming you don't need it, right? Like, yeah. What are you going to do? Touch the button on the screen? So yeah. I kind of don't buy touchscreens, but he's like, oh no, it's great. And now that you're talking about Sean, now I'm going to have to go to Best Buy tomorrow and buy a freaking touchscreen.
Just really expensive friendships, you know?
I know.
Yeah.
We always got to one-up each other. Oh, you bought that new scope? Oh, yeah. Well, that's nice for you. Overnight that bad boy so it can look like I had that scope too.
That looks cool. I'm going to have to get one.
Has anybody used the ATS scope? I've only seen videos of it. You've used it? I mean, is it as clumsy as it looks? Because that thing looks like a nightmare every time I see a video of it.
Well, yeah, and I want to be careful, right? Because I think it's capable, especially as you get into the is it the Pros, right?
I'm talking about Pros like the 8-channel that's on the tablet. Yeah.
Well, they have different. They used to at least have different levels. You had the Elite, which I think was 4, right? And then there's the eScope, and then an eScope Pro, and there's some sample rate differences. But ultimately, yeah, the user interface, depending on where you come from, is a little more or less intuitive maybe than some others. And if you're used to how, a Pico lets you move channels. So you want to slide A and B in a certain way away from C and D, and you just click and drag and you move them. And unless there's been a change recently, you couldn't really do that. You had a different way of going about that seemed a little more tedious. But it has other functions like the built-in rotational cursors that are just bang bang and they're up, and you're looking at it, whatever you're going to use them for, namely, most often by far in cylinder compression, cranking or running. It's a couple clicks and it's up, and you adjust it a little bit and you're rolling. So there's positives and negatives to both, but yeah, I think just straight up user interface, Pico's a little cleaner, a little more intuitive, ATS a little bit less so, but again, there's other functions that it tends to do better or more quickly. So I it's Ford versus Chevy versus Chrysler versus Toyota versus
Yeah, and then there's that great what is it, Pico end gap complaint that everybody complains about.
Well,
right?
yeah,
Like you get into
so-
the
That has to do with, it has to do with how they're capturing and storing data. And if I was better prepared, I'd remember segmented memory. So, okay. Man, I'm probably going to get shot, but
do it.
you have to understand, when I say this stuff, it's not condescending. I think I'm just being honest, and it's not
Well,
it's not saying anything bad about anything. It's just, this is how it captures data. So you have Snap-on and ATS capture into a, ATS is I think almost, well, maybe not almost, but a very large buffer. Okay. And then when it fills that up, it dumps it off the one end and brings it in on the other end. Okay. So it just kind of scrolls through. Snap-on's the same, much smaller buffer. Buffer is scope memory. So we're talking about digital storage oscilloscopes. So it measures the voltage, a point in time. It measures that, it stores it in memory. That's how these all work. Pico kind of does the same thing, but the thing is you've got this large buffer. It's huge. And the amount of time you have on the screen versus so the time base you have versus the number of samples you're requesting, so how you're setting up the scope, determines how many of these sample points are going to be on your screen. And then a scope just connects the dots. That's why we have the lines, but they're made up of little dots, little sample points. What Pico will do then is, if I am not using up that entire buffer for this screen, I will capture screens. The screens, though, end to end, are not seamless. There's a gap. And depending on a few different things, version of Pico, laptop or PC capability, horsepower, if you will, and then the time base determines how long that gap is. And in some cases, it was significant. Now, granted, you might be capturing a minute worth of sample points, but then that gap's going to be, let's just say 2 seconds, just for a number. Guess if it's intermittent, where it's going to happen.
Every time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was labeled the Pico gap, and it, ruffles a lot of feathers with certain, a group of fans of Pico, or, Pico people, whatever we're going to call them.
Pico nerds.
Pico people eaters, or whatever. That's a Minnesota Vikings joke for those of you that don't know.
Purple people eater.
Right? But so it would ruffle feathers. But it's legitimate. That's what it is. So it's not that their buffer works so much differently than the others, but it's what they're trying to do with the unused portion of the buffer that could get you in a little bit of trouble. And there's ways to defeat that, and they're not difficult. And I don't see a lot of it online where people are posting up like, well, Pico screwed me on this.
Yeah.
Dude,
Fell in
if
the
I
Pico
saw
gap.
I'm tagging you in it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Hey, Fanslow,
Pico
guess
gap.
what? No, I only brought it up because, when I was looking at buying a scope, right? Because what do we all do when we're going to drop $5,000 on a scope? You Google reviews of the scope, and it came up, and I remember, I remember having this conversation with you somewhere, and it was at a tool show, and we had a Pico running for something, and you're like, well, let me show you, because you could trick it to because you had a setup, you knew the waveform pattern it was coming. You're like, let me show you what the Pico gap is, and we could demonstrate it. And you're like, here it is. Look how small of a gap it is. And I was like, oh, okay. But it was one of those things that it's nice to talk about here, because you talked about earlier the alias graphing in the MTS 5100. So I felt like it was worth mentioning just in case somebody would ever get it and go, well, how come nobody told me? Well, at least we could say we warned you it might happen. I mean, I've been using the Pico for 6 years. I've never noticed it. So
It goes Same with the snap-ons. If you don't understand how it's collecting data and the shortcomings of some of its performance characteristics, so sample rate versus that memory, if you're not aware of that and how that all correlates, if you don't use the scope properly, you're setting yourself up to alias, because it has to happen. If you thought of it a little bit differently from maybe, for a really bad example, of a Pico perspective, it would make sense why it's aliasing. But, the guy selling you the snap-on scope doesn't understand how it works. I don't know if it's even really his job or her job. Maybe I don't think they call them tech systems guys anymore, where you had the
Tech
truck
reps
with all the cool stuff on it, right? The
Yeah.
smoke machines and the scopes and the scan tools and all that. I don't know if they have those guys anymore, or those salespeople anymore, but I don't know that they would even know it, to be quite honest. But once you understand it and you understand why, and it makes sense, then you just use the scope in such a way that it won't happen. Or, it's going to be a pretty screwy situation where it would, where you're just trying to scope something, a signal that's much, much faster than that thing is really capable of handling. And you're going to run into that with, maybe a lot of them except Pico, because they're kind of absurdly fast. And that's
You can put such a big time base on there and then just zoom in for, to the smallest detail. So that's what I always do, is I just put a bunch of time on there unless I'm trying to trigger a specific event. And then once whatever happens, I just zoom in on it. So I have everything on that one screen.
And I think that's what would happen with the Snap-on users, was you'd see these classes or stuff online with using a Pico, where that's the technique, right? Get a lot of data on the screen and then zoom in for detail. Well, Snap-on can't zoom in, right?
No, Snap-on's backwards.
Exactly. That's the best way to think about it.
And I came from the Snap-on world, and that was my big struggle, right? So I used to have the picture that I wanted, and I'd let it run forever, and then I would zoom out to see where the glitch was, and I could then zoom back into the same level I was at, but you couldn't go any further in. But on my Pico, when I got it, it was the complete opposite. It was set a 10-minute time base, let it record, look where your anomaly is, then click and zoom in. And so for a long time, I would say good 6-7 months of me using my Pico, that was where I struggled, was how to zoom in instead of back out or scroll. Because the other thing that was really interesting is, like you mentioned, the Pico only does screen captures. So if I had two waveforms and one of them was kind of off the screen a little, on the Snap-on you could just scroll to the left and it would move it over so I could see it. And on the Pico, it was like, oh, it's not there.
Next page.
My relative compression waveforms are almost always split between the two screens. Somehow I managed to time that perfectly every single time. So I know what you mean.
So we have to introduce you to single trigger.
Yeah. Yeah. You teach me how to use that.
I want to learn. We have not talked about triggers, but on the LS2000, when you had it, if you didn't set a trigger up, you could not get a picture. I mean, it would just go wherever the flip it wanted. It didn't care. So you were forced to learn triggers. And I think it's a lost skill. Now, the Pico has more triggers than I even can think of.
Yep.
The other day, I really wanted to learn how to use the pulse width trigger because I wanted it to stop at the #1 crank position, which was wider than any other spot. 25 minutes later, I just gave up and set the time base to 10 minutes because I couldn't figure out how to get it to stop there.
See, finally, something I could have helped you with.
You know what's funny? I was like, I should call Matt on this. No, I don't want to sound like an idiot because this can't be that hard. 25 minutes later, I'm like, I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. Forget it. 5 minutes. I'm moving on. But yeah, I mean, triggers has got to be something people need to learn. And there's basic ones, right? So the single point, the repetition trigger, and then you need to know how the trigger is triggering, upslope, downslope. Those are all important. The actual trigger set point, where it's going to trigger, means a lot. Like if you're doing an injector, you don't want to set it at 9 volts. It's going to trigger all the time.
Yep.
set that sucker at 50 volts because then it's only going to trigger on the flyback. So there's tricks to a trigger to get that picture just right. And if you don't know them, boy oh boy will you struggle.
Yeah, and like with Sean's scenario with the relative compression, using the single trigger is really just to help you out when you're by yourself. You can't have somebody in the driver's seat cranking it for you on command. That you can set up the trigger to start drawing that pattern when you want it to start drawing, and probably during the stall current portion or in rush, whatever you want to call that, and the initial spike when you hit the key, and you can set the scope up to start drawing that one division in, and you want to capture 10
cool.
seconds. Yeah, it's sound like a lightsaber.
Cool yeah. Sorry. That was really cool.
It's that cold up here. I had to slice open a tauntaun. But yeah, some of that stuff, some of those features, a lot of it's for either laziness or just make your life easier when you can't have a sidekick there.
You mean I'm the only one that has a 12-foot USB 3.0 cable for my Pico so that I can sit the Pico on my laptop when I'm cranking the car?
You do that so you can sit in the AC.
No, because usually the car doesn't start. Yeah, I think triggers is really important for people to learn. Some things you just don't ever try to trigger. Networks, forget it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the only time I've triggered a network is on recently. I've noticed they have that like end of message peak that seems slightly higher or lower than all the other peaks. So I may set a trigger to hit that, just because then I can get a consistent pattern as I'm looking and unplugging modules. But most times I just never trigger a network. I just let it run.
I mean, that's the boat I'm in, right? I check to see that it hits those voltages I want to see, and then I'll just kind of get a feel for the overall look, if that makes sense.
I think using them on ignition stuff has been really helpful for me to, if I'm looking for a misfire that's not consistent, setting up that trigger for the ignition, really, really handy to just watch that one event repeat over and over again. And okay, there it is. And I can pause and go back. So I'm trying to think of where I use them the most. So that's probably it.
I use them on in cylinders a ton.
Okay.
I always set my trigger to be the upslope of the compression, and I set it usually about 75-80 psi to make sure that if the exhaust valve isn't opening, I don't hit that trigger too, or if it's got a warm cam lobe, you'll see the exhaust spike, but I don't want it to trigger again, because I always do repetitive trigger. I let that sucker run for 30 pages. I've burned up more starters. I wait till it gets to 30 pages. I don't care. It ain't my car. Oh, it needs an engine and a starter. But, yeah, that's another one. If I am doing a sync, like cam crank sync, I will try to set a trigger up on something. That's where I really wish I understood more of the pulse width triggers, because I feel that would be valuable. But I will set a trigger up because and if I'm really doing a sync and I want an exact trigger, I'll do the ignition at that point, the number one coil to be exact, so I know where top dead center is. If the coil's really easy to get out, you're gonna laugh at me. I'll put my WPS in and really get number one top dead center. And the reason I ended up using my WPS one time was I had a car and the only known good I had was a crank with a WPS. I don't know why the guy posted it that way in the Pico library, but that's how he posted it. So that's what I did to compare mine to his. And sure enough, mine was out of time. But I was like, oh, that's kind of nice because I know exactly where number one is now. You know, we didn't talk about math channels.
Oh, yeah.
I learned something from one of the YouTube videos about setting your time base to like 27 minutes or something stupid for an ABS sensor and letting it paint that black page, and then you minus out something so that when you have the glitch, it's the only spot that's left. I watched a YouTube video and then did it because I YouTubed how to do it for my one car. But I was like, man, this was a great trick. I can't even explain how it worked now because it's been so long since I did it. But I like the math channels when you need them.
I was watching a video one on Bernie Thompson's that he's got on YouTube, and he was using the frequency for the crankshaft sensor to find misfires, the crank acceleration and deceleration. And I played around with it a little bit myself, but I definitely am far from perfecting that. I don't know if you guys have messed around with that.
When Pico first came out with the math channels, that was something I did for fun.
You were such a geek.
Well, it's partly my job too at the time.
Oh, okay.
And just to see would it work? Is it viable? And that's why I run into problems, is the viability of it. That, gosh, most scan data kind of points to the cylinder, and if it's wrong, there's other ways to figure out which cylinder is really misfiring, and it's so rare. There's certain car lines you are a little more hypersensitive towards. Certain Volkswagen Audis I'm a little more hypersensitive to. Some maybe earlier GMs, but really now, man, I don't remember the last time I ran into a misidentified cylinder miss. So you usually kind of have an idea which cylinder is misfiring or cylinders, and then you're moving on. Depending on, well, at least from Picos, I've not done the ATS one, so I shouldn't say, and I have not used the USB Autoscope for that with one of their scripts. That with the Pico, when you graph the frequency, almost every crank sensor is encoded, so you get these dropouts, consistent dropouts, right? Because you're looking at the frequency, and it just it messes with you, and you can use math to try to help minimize those.
I had a Jeep Cherokee that was it was basically counting misfires like crazy. I think it was on 2 cylinders, and it was not missing like at all. I mean, the engine was running perfect, but it was flashing the check engine light, misfires. And it ended up being the crankshaft sensor, and it was a AutoZone one or something, and they replaced it with a OEM one. And
this is my surprise face.
I scoped the before and after because I wanted to see, what's the difference on this thing. And I was messing around with some math channels and stuff. And I don't know, I wasn't able to see a difference in it. I was kind of surprised. I was like, I thought I'd see something in there. But maybe, I don't know, maybe with some different eyes on it, maybe there is something to see, but I don't know.
Yeah. And the math channels really, if you think about a scope, it kind of is a kind of like a calculator, right? It subtracts voltage from the lead, if you will, common lead or quote unquote ground lead from the other. And we're typically, a battery, you would see 12 volt difference or 12.6 volt difference. That's what it does. And then the math channels are just allowing you to use the software to calculate certain things, looking at the waveform. So frequency is a really common one, pulse width, or if you're looking at network signals, you can subtract one from the other and kind of look at it the way the module would see that. You could also do that. I think Chris Groff mentioned that. Just taking your leads across can high, can low. Here you would be scoping them separately and then using math channel to do that. Or you could, I think you add them together and then you just get that flat 5 volts, which can kind of come in handy for looking for intermittence, especially at the dealership level, right? That's they see it a lot, or mobile techs that do a lot of work for collision shops where there might be some wiring damage and the network is getting intermittently shorted. They can get that nice flat 5 volts using the math channel and then walk around kicking fenders or slamming doors or hitting seats or floors, wherever they think maybe this harness issue may exist. And then you could see a drop potentially, on a good day, you would see a dropout and go, okay, I'm going to focus in this area of the car and see if I can't track down this damage. And, it's probably going to be on the side it got hit on, but those are some scenarios I can think of at the top of my head for math.
I use the math channel to figure out how much ohms a solenoid is in a transmission.
Oh, yeah.
Put my amp clamp around it, command it on, and then go up. Yep, it's not within ohm spec. Because they never tell you how many amps that sucker should take. They always tell you how many ohms it should be, and it never fails. It'll intermittently set a circuit fault, but you're like, it's just fine. And so I'll drive it around with my amp clamp on it, and I have my math channel running up top, and it just tells me how much resistance is going, which is kind of funny because, it's doing the math for you. So when the solenoid's off, it's like goofed. But then when it comes on, as it ramps up, you get this varying resistance, which is interesting to try to explain to somebody that, the resistance is different until it fully opens. But at least you can check it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Another one for Pico, really before the last few updates of 6 and 7.
No, we are not allowed to talk about 7. 7 is garbage. It should be wiped off the face of the earth.
You couldn't invert. There wasn't really an invert function on Pico. So you could do it with math. And a friend of mine calls me up. He's like, I'm using a channel trying to do duty cycle, but I need to invert it. And so I'm thinking about it, and I come up with this just convoluted equation that worked. And I thought I was a freaking genius, and I send it off to Pico like, hey, I figured this out. And they're so nice. Yeah, they gave me a nice pat on the back and then told me how to do it with like one keystroke. Just put a negative in front of the channel, and that would invert it.
You really appreciate how nice they said it, though, didn't you?
I did. I really did, because if it was me, it would have been a lot
I'm thinking how I would have sent that email back.
It would have been a lot more sarcastic.
Yeah. I'm thinking it would have been like, you really wasted that much time to come up with this when you could have just put a negative sign in front of that?
Yeah, that is a great equation. You came up with that all by yourself? You sure you didn't call your math teacher? Huh? And then, yeah, here's the way to do it. Just put this negative symbol in front of it and I'll invert it. Oh.
Yeah, I don't like Pico 7. I used it once and then deleted it.
It's growing on me, and then sometimes I'll get a little frustrated with it, but it's growing on me.
Growing on you like a cancer, or growing on you like?
I think, when 6 first came out, I hated it. I wrote up quite a few emails complaining about it, and then it became like the best thing ever. And 7's kind of following that a little bit the same way, where I don't know if I don't normally consider myself somebody that's resistant to change. But maybe in this case, that's exactly what's going on. But 6 worked so well for so long, and it's laid out a certain way that you're just used to, and you can do what you need to do so fast. And even though 7, I think you can do any function with no more than 3 clicks, which can't be said with 6. It's not intuitive yet.
Yeah, it's a little glitchy still. I've been trying to mess around with it, and it's...
I'd rather have 5 clicks and have it work than try to figure out which 3 clicks it takes to make it work.
So, yeah, it'll get better. They'll make it better. They have to, right? I mean, that's it. That's what they got.
Yep.
We could always burn it and start over. Just hack into their server, delete all the downloads. Here you go.
I would like to see them get this where it needs to go, and then I'm kind of excited to see what they can do with Pico Diagnostics. Pico Diagnostics is super.
I love that program.
Yeah, super useful, of course, for NVH. But I would like to see some of the other stuff fleshed out more and more, and that could be a really powerful tool, even at at the trade school level, learning level would be great to see it this way on Pico Diagnostics, and then okay, let's try to do it ourselves in the scope. I think that would make some pretty good exercises.
The relative compression in the Pico Diagnostics is by far the greatest invention since the bread slicer.
Is that where you have the WPS just in one cylinder?
Yeah,
and then
any cylinder you want, you put an amp clamp around it, you crank it over, and it is dead nuts accurate, as long as, and here's the caveat, because I've learned this the hard way, as long as you don't pick the bad cylinder. If you pick the bad cylinder, your good cylinders will show like 24,000 PSI of compression. Which instantly tells you there's
You're
something
running slick 50 in this thing? Dang.
And that engine restore really works. I use that a lot. Matter of fact, when I said that's the first tool I pull out of for misfires, that's actually the first thing I do with my WPS is I slam it in a cylinder, put my amp clamp on there, and I run that relative compression, because at that point in time, I have all 4, 6, or 8 cylinders, and I know within 10 PSI what every cylinder is roughly at. And I had a 4-cylinder Kia, so it was real easy to stick it in number 1, run it, and then actually go through each one and check it. And it was within 10 or 15 PSI, I forget now, but it was close enough to where I was like, okay, I can trust these numbers. Because the first time you do it and you see like 180, 180, 180, 130, 180, 180, 175, 130, you're like, those numbers right? Like you question it, but they work. I mean, it's nice.
I'm gonna have to mess around with that a little bit, because I actually haven't done too much with the diagnostic application.
And it's really nice because if you know the firing order, you can even know exactly what cylinder is low in compression. I mean, you don't have to guess. So some of the cars where you can only get to like the front 3 plugs, you can put it in the first hole and go, oh, the firing order is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, well, I'm in hole 4. Because 1, 2, 3 are in the back, so I'm at 4. So then you can start on the Pico. Oh, I'm at 4. So this is 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. Oh, look, 2 is low. And you're done. I believe, if I remember it correctly, the WPS is always in hole A.
Oh, okay.
If not, it should be. I think I've been burned by that, but that's a while ago.
Yeah.
That's a while ago. So, and I sent us a little bit of a complaint, and that, I don't know. Not that my complaints mean anything, but it gets put into a bin, and hopefully enough other people had said anything.
Yeah. It has an asterisk next to the one that has the Pico, that has the WPS in it. So you really can't screw it up. But when you're in a hurry and you're used to it always being A, it's the one time you don't pay attention to the asterisk and it burns you.
Yep.
The battery tester I really like, except it is one fatal flaw. Nobody's alternator comes on anymore when the car starts, so
yep.
I fail a lot of alternators with that.
Yep.
What else is in that?
Yeah, it used to be a strategy was they'd start up and they'd full field them right away, or heavy, heavy excitation.
Yeah, because they wanted to restore the battery because it just lost a whole bunch of amps. But the problem now is starters don't take what they used to. We have these DC brushless, rare earth, ultra low 20 amp drawing starters now, because they only start your car 57 times in 10 miles.
Yeah, it makes liars of us all. You got a freaking Honda Civic, fails a battery test every time it comes in.
Yep.
They just keep driving it. I've never had a problem. Okay. Fails miserably. Load test every time.
Yeah, what else is in there? The battery, the compression. I can't remember.
NVH, and then they kind of have that misfired detection based off of voltage ripple.
Yeah. Oh, the nice thing about the compression that I forgot to mention is you can see the raw data. So
Right.
you can actually see the relative compression graph yourself. And I lied, you don't need an amp clamp. It goes off the battery voltage.
Yep.
So it really teaches you that you can do tests a different way. So yeah, it's a fantastic tool. If you're not using it, you should.
There you go.
There, hey, look, there it is. Oh yeah, prop shaft balancing. Yeah, I've used that one a lot. You know, out there balancing gas all the time.
On the parking lot.
I bought the NVH kit from AES Wave at Vision a couple years ago, or not Vision. It was that show where we were doing the RO. I forget. That's how long ago it was.
Oh man, that was
In Atlanta. Remember that horrible show where there was like no attendees?
they had
It's
to
that
bring
German show. They
Yeah,
brought in the high school students.
Auto Mechanica.
Yeah, Auto Mechanica. George and Carlos had an NVH kit. Or no, you did, because you were at the Pico booth and you didn't want to take it home. And so George sold it to me because, you know, I could take it home with me then through you guys at the Pico booth.
It's too bad it wasn't better attended because, you know, not to get too far off track, but Matt and Justin Morgan are set up at the AES Wave booth with the formerly Oro, was it the 600? IM 600?
Yeah, I am.
Now
600.
now it's known as the Autel IM 608.
608.
They had a BMW
Fem.
Fem. Okay. That they're showing EPROMing on with it. And I mean, it was a great demonstration.
Which only worked once.
It should have been. It should have had quite the crowd around it, but
Yeah, we just decided Justin brought one in so we could screw with it, and we had no idea what it would do. Well, once it unlocks the FEM, it's always unlocked. Once it's jailbroken, essentially, it's always jailbroken. So I was like trying to get Autel Engineering to restore the jailbroken software so we could do the demo again, and they're like, "What? We've never had somebody ask this question." They were so confused why I wanted to make it jailbroken again, because it just wasn't as cool of a demo when it wasn't like unlocking FEM. Yeah, that was a great show. But I bought the NVH from you just so I could figure out what the stupid Chevy shake was in my Silverado, which ended up being my brake rotors. The only time I've used the NVH kit, though.
I don't use it a lot, but when I do, it's a lifesaver. And I'm not saying I do not want to imply I really know NVH inside and out, but I kind of liken it to, you know, one of my horrific analogies that I seem to have endless supply of, but I liken it to you and a buddy on a road trip, and a song comes on the radio and you're trying to think of the name of the band. You can't think of the name of the band, and then your buddy leans over or turns to you and says, starts with an M. Boom, you know exactly who it is. I liken the NVH software to that, where you're feeling this vibration or hearing this drone, and you kind of can't quite put your finger on the cause. And then you look at the NVH data, and you put it up in the simplest of ways, you know, but the bar graphs typically are the easiest way to interpret. And now you see that it's a second order tire or something like that. And now you know exactly what it is.
And I will say that a second order tire could also be a brake rotor because they turn the same rotation. Just clarify this from experience.
Yeah. For us, it was a Honda, the Honda pickup, not the Pilot, but the
Ridgeline.
Yeah, Honda Ridgeline.
Yeah.
Had this drone. It just, you know, drowned out everything in the vehicle in about a 5 mile an hour window. And I mean, you know, the first thing you go after is motor mounts and training mounts, and these things were sacked out. I mean, the engine literally was sitting on the frame. The rubber was gone. So no brainer. It's got to be motor mounts. Put the motor mounts in, then fix it.
Well, that sucks.
Yeah. So it ends up, I think it's I think I'm right, a third order engine, which is a normal vibration, but it shouldn't be transferred into the passenger compartment. And it ends up, it was when you really looked, and you had to really look, you saw that it had an aftermarket drive shaft in it. And if you compared it to the OE drive shaft, which was 3 times or 4 times more expensive, the aftermarket drive shaft was, I don't know, 2-3 inches longer. And, you could squeeze, of course, right? It fit.
Yeah.
But with some effort, you could get it in there, which, if you didn't know better, you weren't really paying attention, it would make sense, right? It just squishes together. It makes sense. It's got to have some travel for bouncing or whatever. And no, that was a big problem. And then the Honda drive shaft was filled. They had something inside, like foam or something. And the aftermarket one part of it was kind of a 2-piece, and the other wasn't. And you put the new drive shaft in and fixed it immediately. And then, of course, you're reprimanding yourself for not noticing it right away. But gosh, there's a lot of people under that vehicle looking at it. Nobody looked at that drive shaft and went, well, that's aftermarket. It didn't have like the big Dorman sticker on it or anything.
Door stop.
Right. It just, you had to stop and really look, and then crap.
Yeah. And then, you're kind of excited. You have your Pico data, because when you're trying to sell this customer this drive shaft, it's stupid money. Plus your diagnostic time you've got involved in it, which you're not getting all of it back, but you're hoping to get most of it back. If it's not right, man, you're crying, because to call that customer and tell them it's not fixed is not good.
Yeah. And I've not had it happen, but if you're doing a lot of noise, vibration, harshness, obviously NVH, if you're doing quite a bit of it and you do repair work and it makes a significant improvement, you have the before and after. And you can save that, right? It's on the computer, or on your Google Drive or whatnot, OneDrive, whatever your choice is of storage. If the customer would ever come back a couple weeks later and be like, it's doing the same thing again, or you know what, it's not better yet, you guys didn't fix my car, you have the proof. You can go for a ride and say, no, when you brought it here, this was 96 decibels in the passenger compartment. Now it's 50. It's not the same. You don't have to be a jerk about it, but you've got some data to back up what you did. I fixed this. This is what it came in with. These are the, this is where the failure was, or the issue, the concern. This is after we did the repair. You can see the before and after. It's in pretty colors. You can print out the graphs, hand it to the customers.
You are so Carroll Shelby right now.
Me? Yeah.
Have you seen Ford versus Ferrari?
You know what? I haven't. I'm waiting for my kid wants to watch it with me.
What the flip is? You need to watch it.
No, I know. No, I know.
Because you're acting like Carroll Shelby is.
Me?
Yeah, in the movie. I would be Ken Miles. I'd walk up and be like, "Look, jerk. It was at 58. It's at 58 now, and it was at 95. I improved it by over 50%. Get the hell out of my parking."
I think his job would be pretty kick-ass. His and like Lee Iacocca, like, hey, help our struggling manufacturer. Let's create some awesome cars. I think I could do that.
Watch the movie. You'll be like, oh, that job sucked.
Probably. Let's get this really tiny car and just shove this huge engine in it.
You need to watch the movie.
Yeah. But that Cobra wasn't the one that won it was the 289 Cobra that won. Was it Le Mans?
It won 3 races, technically. Yeah. But you need to watch the movie.
Okay. No, I fully plan on it.
Like now.
I haven't seen that either, so let's check that out.
Yeah.
You're in some Democratic states, so your schools aren't open. So just let your kid watch it tonight. It'd be good education. Sorry.
No, campus is open. I'm in class tomorrow. Oh.
I have 14 minutes of battery life left. So what else we want to talk about?
No, I got to get downstairs to my wife because I got home from work and I came right up here. So.
Oh, well, you're sleeping on the couch, so enjoy that.
It's warmer downstairs, so it's good.
Well, I think, yeah, to maybe start the wrapping it up is the scope is the one of those the better ways to gather the raw data, right? Scan tool data, by and large, is interpreted, not just by us, but by a module. And the scope allows you raw data. And sometimes part of our process would lead us to need to get that raw data. And then the other thing is using it as a learning tool, either as a student or trying to get better. And then I think it's like anything, almost, here we go with another crap analogy. It's almost like learning martial arts. Sometimes you learn them so you don't have to ever fight. You use the scope, you get really, hopefully really, really good or pretty skilled with it, pretty adept with it. And you find over time certain things that you always use the scope on because now you know how it works, what's going on. You don't necessarily need it. And that's not trying to displace the scope. The scope is what got you to that point. If that makes sense.
I think so. We can all be scope ninjas.
Scope ninjas. When he's like, "Oh, it's like martial arts. It's something you never ever want to use." I'm like, "No, it's like carrying a gun. You never want to use it. Have you got to pull it out?"
Well, there's some
Crap's
reasonability to
gone
that,
wrong.
though. That would be reasonable, right? You try to get a depth of it. Oh, we got rid of him?
His battery must have run out real fast for 14 minutes.
Oh, it's on. But yeah, I don't think that's a horrible analogy either. Is you get a depth with it, and hopefully you never have to use it. So you did all that learning and training and getting very adept with it, so that when you did need to use it,
you definitely
skilled.
need it out.
Yeah.
when
but
you're actually
also
pulling it out.
Also trained, hopefully, to not use it when you don't have to. And it's not like this. I'm not trying to spout off about guns or nothing. It has nothing to do with that. Just the analogy with the scope, that you get to a point where now you're not pulling out the scope, needlessly, or we're trying to work more and more efficiently, more and more productively. Now do I need to pull the scope out to do this? No, I don't. Not this time. But now the next vehicle, it's like, I need to get the scope out, so I can get this done faster. Just working smarter, and that can be part of it.
Yeah, when that's going to be most efficient in your process to actually pull that out and start messing with it, or this might be a waste of time if I take it out here because I'm not really sure. Yeah, that's I guess that's where we're all hoping to get. It's just let's be more efficient, figure this out quicker.
Yeah, and I think it, like what we were talking before, it starts out with certain tests. So I had the I talked about the mass airflow sensor, or fuel pump current used to be all the rage. All these different tests became very important. We learned more and more about how these systems worked, and because of that, may not need to scope it. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, it built your understanding of the system better than it was before by going in depth, looking at all the waveforms, understanding the physical components through the electrical waveform or pressure waveform. I know, like the compression waveforms, just from studying them, I understand the 4-stroke better process.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that.
In my head.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I don't want to be jumping around to all these different portions of the scope discussion, but in-cylinder compression is extremely important, I think, for young, not even young, age doesn't have anything to do with it, but people coming into the trade to become techs. If they didn't grow up the way a lot of us grew up with, small engine backgrounds, or grew up at a shop, grew up on a farm where you're still taking stuff apart and fixing it. A lot of these students have no real concept of what's going on inside of an engine. They do the way you explain it, and you can show them the videos, but they've never had a piston in their hand. They've never seen valves move. They never lapped valves to, learn about valve sealing and stuff like that. So they've never had that experience. And now the use of that in-cylinder waveform, now they can kind of have this picture of what's going on pressure-wise in the cylinder. And it becomes very, very important. And like you're saying, you understand the 4-stroke cycle so much better. You know, when this stuff really started becoming more and more common and part of a discussion, there was some hardcore engine people that have built, you know, racing engines. They know engines, but you show them that compression waveform and you point to like EVO, they know cam specs, they know valve opening specs, but when they see that, they can hardly get their head wrapped around this is a visual representation that the exhaust valve opens before the piston ever reaches bottom dead center. And it's awesome to watch their eyes get wide as that really hammers home more and more stuff. So I think it's just that much more important for students coming in to get that visual reference mental reference, because what are the chances they're going to be tearing down an engine in the real world? Maybe cylinder heads, but God, is anybody really replacing pistons anymore? Unless you work at a very
dealer
specific
or
yeah.
And it's same for electrical too. Is, you know, for the most part, we can't see it. We can't actually see it with our eyes. So, man, having a picture, having that visualization, for especially if you know very little about it, you're just learning. I think it makes all the difference to when you don't have a scope in front of you, you've got a picture in your mind, and maybe it's that Pico waveform that's in your mind, but you got that from actually using the tool and learning what's
seeing a voltage, seeing voltage versus current, and how they kind of work together, if you will.
Just hooking up the leads for my students. Like, here's an amp clamp, here's what it's doing, here's a voltage lead, here's what you need to do to get that waveform. I think honestly just that helps them with the concepts a little bit, because like, what are we measuring, what are we looking at here?
In the hands-on classes, that's kind of the thing, right? There's kind of, I suppose, three pretty distinct areas of scope use. There's the buttons, what button does what, and then there's the hooking it up. Like, what do I got to do to get what I need? You know, I want to see voltage. What do I have to do with these leads to make that happen? I want to see current.
Signal acquisition.
Yeah. And then now I have this waveform. What am I looking at? And I'm probably missing something else important, but those seem to be the big three. And what we find in the hands-on portion is a lot of people can do the buttons and they can interpret the waveform, but when you get them car side, they struggle. So that's really important for them to spend some time under the hood or wherever, you know, to get the signal acquisition. And then there's others struggle with the what button does what. How do I get this picture on my screen, and then so I can look at it? How should I be looking at it? And then interpretations, you know, I think different people have different ways of deciding what's good and bad. Like, maybe it's just seeing a few good ones and referencing it and using your memory that way. And some people and I might be more that type, is if I kind of understand the circuit, I can figure out what I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's the goal, is to be able to analyze what's in front of you rather than memorize every single other one that you've seen. Just taking it case by case.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. One more big thank you to both Matts for being on the show today. I really enjoyed that talk and learned a whole bunch. I always do, getting to talk to everybody in the automotive field. It's a lot of fun, even for myself. So hopefully you learned something from that as well and you enjoyed the episode. But other than that, let's get out there, start fixing the world, one car at a time.